Excuse me, this isn't the welfare line. First class is for people who can actually afford it. Those words cut through the cabin like a blade, slicing through the quiet murmur of pre-flight conversations and settling into a silence so heavy. It felt like the air itself had stopped moving. I had just settled into seat 2A, adjusting my reading glasses and scrolling through quarterly reports on my tablet, when flight attendant Vanessa Clark loomed over me, with the kind of authority that comes from years of unchecked assumptions. The sting wasn't physical, there was no hand raised against me, but her voice carried a cruelty far more devastating, cold and dismissive, and absolutely certain that I didn't belong in that leather seat. Every passenger in first class froze, their conversations dying mid-sentence, as dozens of eyes turned toward me, waiting to see if I would crumble under the weight of public humiliation or find the strength to stand tall in a moment that would define not just my flight, but the trajectory of several lives. If you're watching this, feel free to subscribe and let me know where you're tuning in from. Because now, I'm going to tell you a story about what happened when prejudice met power at 30,000 feet, and how 10 minutes of silence revealed truths that changed everything. My name is Charles Beaumont. I'm 72 years old, a black man who has carried more titles than I ever imagined possible as a boy. Growing up in the segregated neighborhoods of New Orleans, entrepreneur, founder, chairman of Beaumont Global Logistics, Weedover, and lately, a man who has learned that the price of success is the constant vigilance required to protect your dignity in a world that still questions whether you've earned your place at the table. I was born back when a colored boy's dreams rarely stretched beyond the block where he took his first steps, in an era when aspirations were measured, not by what you could achieve, but by what society would allow you to attempt. But I was stubborn even then, blessed with the kind of defiance that my late wife Evelyn would later describe as either my greatest strength or my most dangerous weakness. I would spend hours watching planes streak across the Louisiana sky, silver arrows cutting through clouds, and I promised myself that one day I would sit inside one of those miraculous machines, not as someone begging to prove he belonged, not as a passenger grateful for tolerance, but as a man who had earned his seat through the same sweat and sacrifice that built empires. Life tested that promise at every conceivable turn. I went from loading cargo on the docks to studying by candlelight when the electricity was shut off, from clerical positions where I was invisible to boardroom meetings where I was the only black face in a sea of white collars and inherited privilege. I learned early that real power doesn't come from the titles they reluctantly hand you or the recognition they grudgingly provide. It comes from the iron discipline required to rise every single time a door slams in your face, from the refusal to accept that someone else's limitations should define your possibilities. Brick by brick, deal by deal, I built Beaumont Global Logistics from nothing more than one rented truck and a cramped office above a corner grocery store. The humiliation of Vanessa Clark's words would have been devastating enough on its own, but what followed was far worse than any single act of prejudice could have been. The silence that settled over the first-class cabin was not the respectful quiet of passengers minding their own business. It was the deliberate, calculated silence of people who had witnessed injustice and chosen to look away, rather than risk their own comfort. By speaking truth to power, around me sat men and women whose careers had been built on my recommendations, whose business ventures had flourished because of contracts I had personally guaranteed, whose children had attended Ivy League universities, on scholarships funded by foundations I had established. My chief financial advisor, Marcus Hale, who could navigate the most complex international markets with brilliant precision, suddenly found his smartphone screen fascinating enough to warrant his complete attention. My longtime attorney, Gloria Benton, who had defended my interests through decades of high-stakes negotiations and hostile takeover attempts, folded her hands in her lap and studied the carpet pattern as though it contained the secrets of the universe. These were not strangers who owed me nothing. These were people who had sat at my dinner table, who had celebrated holidays with my late wife Evelyn and me, who had built their professional reputations on the strength of their association with Beaumont Global Logistics. Yet, when I faced the kind of open public humiliation that no human being should have to endure, they chose the path of least resistance, protecting their own social standing, rather than defending the man who had lifted them from obscurity to success. Their inaction revealed more about the true nature of loyalty than any boardroom betrayal ever could have. I remembered Evelyn's gentle but firm warning, spoken during one of our quiet evening conversations. In the garden she loved so dearly, she told me that betrayal rarely comes from declared enemies who make their intentions clear from the beginning. Instead, betrayal most often arrives in the form of silence from those you believed would stand with you, when standing required courage rather than convenience. In that moment, suspended 30,000 feet above the earth, in a cabin filled with people who owed their prosperity to my generosity, her words lived again with painful clarity. I had spent decades rewarding what I believed was genuine loyalty, with unprecedented generosity, lifting those around me as I climbed from the loading docks of New Orleans to the executive suites of global commerce. I had shared opportunities that transformed lives, opened doors that would have remained permanently sealed, and provided financial backing for dreams that would have remained forever unrealized without my intervention. Yet when I faced the kind of raw, undiluted prejudice that reduces a man's lifetime of achievement to the color of his skin, they chose comfort over courage, self-preservation over solidarity. Vanessa Clark's words had revealed her own ignorance and arrogance, but their silence revealed something far more devastating: the fundamental rot within my own carefully constructed circle of trust. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, and the steady hum of the engines filled the cabin with their mechanical rhythm, my thoughts turned inevitably to Evelyn, as they always did in moments when the world seemed determined to test the foundations of everything I had built. She had been gone for nearly a decade now, yet her presence in my life remained as tangible and guiding as the North Star that once helped ships navigate treacherous waters. In times like these, when prejudice and betrayal converged to create perfect storms of doubt, I could almost hear her voice cutting through the chaos, with the clarity that only comes from a lifetime of watching people reveal their true nature under pressure. Evelyn used to remind me, during those quiet Sunday mornings on our back porch, overlooking the garden she tended with such devotion, that dignity is not something others can grant or withhold. It is something you carry within yourself, especially in silence, and particularly when the world seems convinced that you don't deserve the space you occupy. She understood, perhaps better than I did in those early years of building Beaumont Global Logistics, that respect earned through achievement could be fragile, but self-respect forged through adversity was unbreakable. I thought back to those brutal early years, when doors closed before I could even state my business, when bank loans were denied before applications were properly reviewed, when potential partners suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts, the moment they realized they would be dealing with a black entrepreneur rather than the white associate they had assumed they were meeting. Evelyn's wisdom had given me the strength to walk back into those same rooms, composed and unshaken, time after time, until arrogance and assumption finally crumbled before discipline and undeniable results. That same lesson steadied me now, as I sat in seat 2A, surrounded by the tangible evidence of my success, yet stripped of the illusions I had carried about the people I had chosen to trust. I studied Vanessa Clark as she moved through the aisle, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable, protected by uniform and protocol from the consequences of her assumptions. But the greater revelation, the one that cut deeper than her ignorance ever could, came not from observing her continued arrogance, but from witnessing the behavior of those who should have known better. Marcus Hale's continued fascination with his smartphone screen, Gloria Benton's sudden intense interest in the contents of her briefcase, the uncomfortable shifting and deliberate avoidance of eye contact from the other members of my executive team, all of it painted a picture that was both crystal clear and deeply disturbing. These people had grown comfortable in their success, and comfort, I now realized, had eroded whatever courage they might have once possessed. Wealth had made them risk-averse, prosperity had made them conflict-averse, and success had transformed them into the very kind of people who prioritize social acceptance over moral courage. 10 minutes. That was all the time it took for a lifetime of accumulated respect to evaporate, for carefully constructed professional relationships to reveal their true foundations, and for me to reach a decision that had been years in the making, but had crystallized in the span of a single, humiliating confrontation 30,000 feet above the earth. I had tolerated smaller betrayals before. Minor acts of disloyalty I had excused for the sake of maintaining stability within my organization. There had been the subtle credit-taking in board meetings, the convenient memory lapses, when difficult decisions required moral courage, the gradual erosion of the principles that had once guided our collective success. I had rationalized these failures as the inevitable cost of doing business with human beings, telling myself that perfection was an impossible standard, and that loyalty, like any other commodity, existed in varying degrees of quality and commitment. But this moment, this profound silence in the face of open, undeniable disrespect, represented something fundamentally different. This was not a minor compromise, not a moment of weakness explained away by circumstance or pressure. This was a complete moral failure, a willing abandonment of principle when principle mattered most. And it told me everything I needed to know about the character of the people I had chosen to trust with my legacy. As we continued to soar through the cloudless sky, I began drafting the future in my mind with the same methodical precision I had once applied to hostile takeover bids and complex international mergers. The decision-making process was remarkably simple. Once I stripped away the emotional complications that had previously clouded my judgment, Vanessa Clark would never again have the opportunity to humiliate another passenger, not while wearing any uniform connected to my business interests or personal travel arrangements. Marcus Hale would no longer manage my financial portfolio or have access to the confidential information that had made his career possible. Gloria Benton would be professionally and permanently severed from my legal affairs, her decades of service rendered meaningless by her failure to act when action was required. The rest of my executive team, those men and women who had allowed me to sit in stunned isolation while my dignity was publicly shredded, would soon discover that their comfortable positions came with expectations that extended beyond mere competence. They would learn that cowardice, regardless of how it might be rationalized or explained, carries consequences that are both swift and irreversible. It was not anger that moved me toward these decisions, though anger certainly had its place in the emotional spectrum I was experiencing. Rather, it was alignment, the simple recognition that my organization had drifted away from the values that had made our success possible in the first place. Evelyn used to say that a man's legacy is defined not just by what he manages to build during his productive years, but by what he consistently refuses to tolerate. When those achievements are threatened by moral weakness or ethical compromise, when we finally touched down at our destination, the air itself felt different, heavier with possibility, sharper with the electric tension that precedes fundamental change. My staff gathered in the private terminal, expecting the usual post-flight debrief, a routine discussion of business matters and travel logistics, as predictable as the sunrise. Instead, they were about to witness the complete dismantling of the comfortable assumptions that had governed their professional lives for far too long. The reckoning I had planned, during those 10 minutes of silent reflection at cruising altitude, was not delivered with theatrical anger or dramatic pronouncements. It came instead with the quiet, methodical precision that had characterized every significant decision of my career. Vanessa Clark was removed from any future service related to my travel, her arrogance and prejudice finally meeting consequences that her previous experiences had never taught her to expect. Airline management would soon discover that certain contracts and partnerships are far more fragile than assumed. Dependent on respect and professionalism, that had been catastrophically abandoned. Marcus Hale, whose financial acumen had once earned my trust, learned that brilliance without backbone holds no value in my world. His termination was swift and absolute. Access to accounts, client relationships, and confidential information was revoked immediately. The man who found his smartphone screen more compelling than defending his benefactor would have ample time to contemplate that choice while seeking new employment. Gloria Benton, once among my most trusted advisors, discovered that decades of legal expertise could be undone by a single failure of moral courage. Her dismissal was final, without appeal or reconsideration. The silence she had chosen in my hour of need now defined the end of her career with me and the remaining members of my executive team, those who had witnessed injustice and chosen comfort over courage, faced the truth that their positions had always depended on more than competence alone. They discovered that cowardice, no matter how carefully rationalized, carries consequences far beyond the moment of failure. Some would survive this culling through genuine remorse and change. Others would learn that certain bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt through apology or explanation. This transformation was not revenge. It was clarity, a recognition that my organization had grown complacent. That success had bred a moral softness, which threatened everything we had built. That evening, I sat alone in my study with a glass of bourbon. I thought of Evelyn and imagined her quiet approval of my resolve. I thought of the boy I once was in New Orleans, watching planes carve through the sky, dreaming of a day when I would command my own destiny, instead of begging for acceptance from those who questioned my right to exist in their spaces. Thank you for being here. Don't forget to subscribe, and feel free to share your story in the comments. Every voice has value,